In the spirit of Halloween, what is the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you? I used to work at a museum that was once a prison. Over the course of my 8+ years working there, I've been pushed, slapped, bitten, dragged, and punched by unseen entities. I always had issues locking up certain buildings at night because you never knew what might be waiting around a corner. One time I went into the cell house to turn off the lights. As I rounded the doorway, I saw a full-bodied apparition standing there in an inmate's uniform. A split second later, he vanished into thin air. There was a notorious inmate who had been involved in one of the prison riots, and his spirit would often follow me around the grounds. One night, I was with a paranormal group and we went into an area that's off-limits to the public because it's in disrepair. Suddenly, we were screamed at to leave, and something snarled at me. It wasn't uncommon for me or one of my coworkers to have shadow figures follow us. We even had visitors chased out of certain buildings like maximum security by these entities. The absolute worst place in the facility was the tower. I went up there once with a group, and one of my coworkers was physically pinned to the wall by an unseen force. 3 large men tried to pull him away from the wall but couldn't. That's how strong this thing was. It only released him when I started yelling at it. We went to leave, and while going down the stairs, which were quite steep, I felt a huge shove from behind that almost knocked me off my feet, accompanied by a voice screaming at me to go away. I've never been in a yelling match with a spirit before, but I ended up in one that night. I used to live in a small apartment on a hill in Okinawa. At the bottom of the hill, and along the road leading up to my apartment, were grave sites. It's Okinawa, so they're everywhere. The weekend I moved in, I decided to have a housewarming party with my closest friends. We had Orion beer, Strong Zero, and taco rice. At the time, I didn't drink, so I often became the designated driver, happily driving my drunk friends around. That night, my friend Takuma came up with the brilliant idea to visit the Nakagusuku Castle ruins and the old haunted hotel nearby. Why not, right? We piled into my little Subaru Impreza, played some music, and started driving. As we got closer to the ruins, the temperature suddenly dropped. It was September in Okinawa, so it should have been around 28 degrees Celsius at night. No reason for it to feel that cold. But inside the car, we were all shivering. Then, my very well-maintained car started sputtering and died. I managed to restart it right away, but everyone thought it was strange. And to top it off, my friend's watch, a brand new Breitling he'd just received from his grandfather, stopped working. We pulled over to the side of the road, trying to process all the weird things happening. Out of nowhere, another friend in the car started sobbing. She kept saying that we needed to go home and that they're not happy. She wasn't religious or spiritual at all, but she was talking about spirits warning her. Something was definitely off. I turned around and drove home just as fast as we left. I wasn't taking any chances. When we got back to my apartment, I broke my no-drinking rule and poured myself a glass of whiskey. We all sat around quietly for a while. There wasn't much joking or talk about what had just happened. The mood was almost somber. We drank in this strange, polite silence until everyone eventually fell asleep. The next afternoon, after everyone had gone, Takuma came by with his mother to help me finish unpacking. As soon as she got to my door, she freaked out. She left for an hour and came back with salt, incense, sage, a few charms, and started chanting while sprinkling salt all around my apartment. She told me not to get rid of the salt for at least 7 days. We never told her about what had happened the night before. Okinawa is known for being haunted, but for a long time I thought it was all just exaggerated ghost stories. That night happened 11 years ago, and it still feels as fresh as ever. In the late 70s, my uncle was studying medicine at the University of Chicago. After a morning class, he decided that he would hitchhike back home to Lincoln Park on the north side instead of paying for a taxi. A man drove up in a Plymouth Satellite and offered my uncle a ride. The man looked normal and seemed friendly, lighthearted even, so my uncle got in the car and they started driving towards Lakeshore Drive. However, once they got there, the man drove south on Lakeshore instead of north. My uncle told the man he was going the wrong way and to turn around and head north. The man looked at my uncle, put his hand on his knee and said, "No, son, you are coming with me," and smiled darkly at him. My uncle froze in panic, and when they hit traffic near the South Shore, he quickly unlocked the passenger door and ran away without looking back. A year or two later, on a cold December day, my uncle was having coffee in a cafe with my future aunt when he caught something on the TV that made his blood run cold. He saw the man who had picked him up from school that day the year before. He had been arrested for the suspected rape and killing of over 20 young men. The man on the television was John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer. He had removed the door handle off the passenger side door to prevent the men he picked up from escaping. We had a bag lady in town named Annie, and we would regularly get calls about her, shoplifting, disturbing the peace, and so on. Depending on her mood, she would sometimes fight officers when they tried to arrest her. No one wanted to hurt her, so taking her into custody could be quite the ordeal. Annie didn't bathe regularly, but she made up for it by applying generous amounts of Stetson aftershave. The smell was overpowering. It would make your eyes water and linger in your car for hours. The first time I had to arrest her, I used my calm Fraser Crane voice, and it went pretty smoothly. On the way to the jail, I asked if she'd eaten. When she said no, I stopped and got her a 2-piece chicken meal with a biscuit. I then drove slowly so she could finish eating before we arrived. After that, whenever she got into trouble, she'd request that I be the one to take her to jail. Fast forward a few years, and I had been promoted to sergeant. My old marked cruiser, number 61, was parked in the motor pool lot, waiting to be reissued. As a supervisor, I had been assigned an unmarked car. Later that afternoon, I responded to a fatal accident that one of my officers was handling. It was Annie. She had been run over by a truck and killed. I was pretty upset. I had unofficially taken on the role of her protector, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have been there to prevent it. Later that night, a deputy from the sheriff's office called in, reporting that someone was hiding in one of our cruisers in the back lot. I was heading in to do paperwork, so I got there first. The deputy radioed to tell me which car it was. Number 61, my old cruiser. I walked up to the car and saw no one inside. Another officer brought a key so we could unlock it and check for any damage. When I opened it up, the first thing I smelled was Stetson aftershave. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. I manage a venue that used to be a Roman Catholic church. It was later abandoned and turned into a flop house for many years. Now I often find myself alone in the building late at night, closing up after shows or club nights. Over time, I've had several strange experiences there. One evening, I was walking along the mezzanine area toward a room that everyone had told me was haunted. And while I love ghost stories, I don't really believe in the supernatural. I was en route from one area to another, on a mission to do some logistical task. I paused at the railing, and out of nowhere, I felt a hard grip around my ankle as if something was grabbing me from below. The strange thing was, it was a 25-foot drop to the main floor beneath me. I jumped backward and looked everywhere, but I saw nothing. Another time, I was having a meeting with a collaborator in broad daylight. We were sitting on a plush couch in the middle of the space, enjoying our conversation about a potential series of events we could do. There was one cushion of space between him and myself on the couch. Suddenly, mid-sentence, I felt the distinct sensation of someone walking up to us and then sitting directly between us. We both paused and just stared at the cushion, which was moving. There was an impression as though someone had sat down, and there was a palpable energy and tension in the air. We sat frozen in silence for about 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity in a business meeting. Finally, I waved my arms through the space, trying to laugh it off, but we both felt uneasy. We were both confused and shaken, and ended the meeting quickly. There have been countless instances of strange occurrences, seeing figures in the mirrors, hearing doors slam, and voices calling my name from distant corners when I knew I was alone. The custodian once told me she refuses to clean at night after hearing someone quietly praying in the confessional at 3 a.m. People like to say it's the ghosts of Irish Catholic priests or parishioners who haunt the building, but in my opinion, it's more likely tied to the time when the church sat empty and served as a shelter for drug addicts and prostitutes, people who may have died there in desperation, lost and in pain. My mom's friend called her and was slightly hysterical. She was convinced that her house was haunted. My mom is a scientist and she didn't believe in the paranormal, but she agreed to come check it out. The friend was adamant that something was wrong. Either her house was haunted or she was losing her mind, and in either case, she needed help. When my mom arrived, the friend began showing her the strange things that had been happening. First, they went to the living room. There is a brass lamp so shiny that you can see the reflection of the kitchen behind you. She asks my mom to watch the reflection in the lamp. My mother sees a shadowy figure of a man step out from behind the wall. She turns around, but no one was there. This happened several times. She'd see the shadow in the lamp, but whenever she turned, the kitchen was empty. Next, they went to her friend's son's room. They turned off the lights and closed the door, but left the hallway light on. As my mom is looking at the strip of light under the door, she sees very clearly the shadow of 2 feet stepping in front of the door. She quickly opened it, but again no one was there. The same thing kept happening over and over. Finally, they went to lie down on the friend's bed. Her friend fluffs up the comforter, and it falls on top of their legs. My mother could see the indentation of someone sitting on top of the comforter. Her friend fluffs up the comforter, and it happens again. My mom, who had tried her best to find a logical explanation, couldn't explain any of it. So the friend went to a psychic soon after, who told her that it wasn't the house that was haunted. It was the furniture. The furniture was second-hand, bought at a garage sale. Mom's friend got rid of the furniture, and the paranormal stuff stopped. The scariest thing I've had happened while camping. My mom lives in Western Oregon. I went to visit her for the summer, and she's very outdoorsy, so we decided to take the 1-hour drive from her city to the coast. We ended up at this free campsite at the top of this huge foothill, and we were the only campers there. We relaxed for the rest of the day, made food, etc. Suddenly, a truck full of men drove up the hill, talked with my mom, and then left. Fast forward to the middle of the night. I wake up to my mom sitting straight up in the tent. I'm a light sleeper, so when I heard her gasp, it also woke me. As soon as she saw I was awake, she put her hand over my mouth because I was starting to ask her what's wrong. It was dead silent, and all of a sudden, we heard footsteps right beside the tent. The little flap that covers the zipper started moving. Thankfully, my mom has quick wits and said very loudly, "Kenny, grab the gun!" Kenny is my dad, and mind you, he was not there. Just us girls, like I previously said. They left, whoever they are. No harm was done. Thank the Lord for my mama. Throughout my childhood, my father and I would take late-night walks due to his insomnia from shift work. Our neighborhood was considered very safe, mostly urban, except for one road at the back lined with a thick forest. The wooded area stretched for about 1.25 miles, looping back into itself. These walks hold very dear memories for me, except for one, which ended up being our last. Along the road by the tree line, there was a single streetlight that illuminated a small, overgrown, and poorly kept plot of land. It was common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest and ease of circling back. One night, as we were walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stopped. He pulled me close, covered my mouth with his hand, crouched down with me, and pointed toward the illuminated plot, roughly 100 yards away. At first I didn't see anything and thought he was joking, but just as I was about to protest, I saw it. A very small, humanoid figure about 3 feet tall, scrawny with long limbs. It seemed to materialize from the brush and cautiously surveyed the area before signaling toward the undergrowth. A few seconds later, 2 more small humanoid figures appeared. After a brief moment of what looked like a discussion, all 3 of them dashed toward the forest tree line. As soon as they moved, my father scooped me up, threw me over his shoulder, and ran home, which was roughly a half-mile back. He carried me without slowing down, driven by fear and adrenaline. After that night, we never took another late-night walk. My father installed 4 bright motion detection lights around our acre plot and brought home a dog. I've tried to bring it up a few times, but he refuses to discuss it and made it clear he never wants to. Those figures still give me chills, and the image of the 3 huddled together is still very vivid in my mind 15 years later. One night, my youngest son had woken me up at around 3 a.m. crying from a bad dream. He was 4 at the time. After calming him down, he told me he was hungry, so we headed to the kitchen for a snack. He's sitting there eating cereal when he just kind of looks up and then casually tells me that the boy who woke him up is sitting in the corner crying. He nods toward the empty corner of the room, right by the table where we were sitting. I asked him why the kid was crying, just kind of humoring him. Without skipping a beat, he said, "His mommy crashed the car up the road and now he's trying to figure out what's going on. He woke me up. Please tell him to go. Thinking that my kid is still in shock from the bad dream, I looked at the corner and say, "Hey kid, go back to your mom." My son finished his cereal and handed me the bowl. Jokingly, I asked him if it worked, if the boy had left. He looks at me real serious and says, "Yes, he told me the ambulance is coming. They're all dead anyways." Not even a minute later, a string of cop cars and an ambulance go past our house, sirens blazing. I got this feeling of the most intense dread while the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I shook it off, told myself it was just a kid's imagination and coincidence, and we went back to bed. A few days later, my neighbor tells me all about the big wreck a mile up the street from us. Apparently, some lady was going too fast and flipped the car coming around a curve. No one survived. The accident had occurred at 3 a.m, the same night my son had woken me up. I didn't dare ask if a little boy had been in the car. I was on holiday in Bangladesh, and I was riding a tuk-tuk at night. I was staying in a village with only one way to get there, a one-way road, and it had no lights. If it was nighttime, the only light you could rely on was the headlights, and tuk-tuk headlights are shit. We were driving on this muddy path when I started feeling weird. It was really strong, but I was able to ignore it. Then the driver and I saw this woman. She was wearing a red sari and was staring out at the water. When I looked down, her feet were twisted backward, facing toward us, but her whole body was facing away from us. She's holding a water pot and just watering the ground. No plants, just the ground, but it doesn't get wet. Then her body started to shake and we just left. Ain't nobody got time for that juju shit. It was over 10 years ago now when a friend and I visited Japan. It was our first time there, so we went with a tour company. However, after the tour ended, we stayed an extra night in a hotel in East Ikebukuro. During the tour leader tells us stories of haunted hotels and other urban myths, as you do over beers. One of the things he'd tell us was to be wary if you find a room where the head of the bed was positioned next to the window. So if you look up while lying in bed, you look out the window. He'd try to scare us by saying in those rooms, ghosts would come through the window at night and drag you out to your death. Back to the East Ikebukuro Hotel. We checked in the early evening, and the first thing we notice is how small the room was. The second thing is, they gave us a double bed instead of twin singles. And the third, the bed head was right next to the window. We rationalized that the room was too small to align the bed any other way, and the tour leader was full of it. To be honest, we were more annoyed that we had to share a double bed. My friend and I decided to just let it go since it was just for one night. That night, I get woken up by a door slamming shut, and I jolt up. There, sitting at the foot of the bed, is a woman in a blue kimono. She had long hair, and from what I could make out, her kimono had butterflies on it. I freak out and bury my head under my pillow. I remember thinking, is this real? How can I check without looking? In my genius, I decided to shuffle my foot down the bed thinking, if I don't touch anything, it's just my imagination. I didn't think about what I'd do if I did touch something. Little by little, my foot moves down the bed when I notice that there is definitely a depression at the foot of the bed. Someone or something was there. I retreat my foot, start to sweat, and at this point, I just start repeatedly saying the Lord's Prayer until I fall back asleep. I remember waking up at 6 the next morning, and my friend was already dressed and packed. I asked him if he saw or heard anything last night, and all he says is, "I don't want to talk about it. Let's check out." This happened at the house we lived in for about 7 years. Many strange things happened in that house. You could hear voices murmuring from time to time, and I saw someone stick their head into the room once. None of it felt hostile, but the same couldn't be said for this pervasive feeling my mother and I both felt if we went out front at night. She and I both felt like something was watching, and it wasn't friendly. On this particular night, it was about midnight or so, and I felt like driving to the 24/7 grocery store since I wanted some snacks. As I stepped out the front door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye and turned to look. There was this very tall thing just floating. For lack of a better term, I'd almost describe it as hanging, but nothing was holding it up. It was seemingly covered in a sheet that had once been white but was extremely dirty, so it was more off-white and got more brown with mud and dirt the further down it went. There were no visible feet, eyes, or face, but I could tell it was staring at my brother's window. As I stared at it, it turned to look at me, and I remember feeling like one of those butterfly specimens, pinned to a board. It was as if its stare was physically holding me in place. It felt like an eternity, but only a second or two passed, and it looked back at the window. The pressure lifted and then vanished. I decided that it might be best to just make some popcorn or something that night instead. I was working the night shift when a ward patient's relative came running to the nurse's station in a panic. "Nurse, come quick!" she cried. "What happened?" I asked. "You have to see it for yourself." We then ran to the ward, and an old lady patient was crying and holding onto the bed for dear life. Her bed was shaking. Now, you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking, but she was this frail, practically emaciated thing. She couldn't have barely rattled the bed rails. The ward had only 2 other patients in it and their respective watchers. Everyone was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright. Apparently, that particular ward was seldom used, and the bed that old lady lay in was rarely occupied. People who have slept in it complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirits called dibs on that particular bed. I volunteered as an EMT in a small village just outside NYC. One night, we were on call for not only our town but the surrounding 2 villages, which were out of service. One of the villages isn't exactly the best neighborhood. Generally, we always have a police officer on every scene we go to just because they can always get there faster. This time around, though, there was a fire on the other side of town and some sort of crime investigation elsewhere. Basically, PD resources were stretched thin. A call came in for a 25-year-old male with a facial wound at a private residence with instructions that the patient was in the backyard. We were dispatched and told that there was no police available and no advanced life support available. It was just me and my driver. We get on scene, and it was an apartment building with an open yard in the back. My driver pulls onto the yard, and he sees the patient sitting in the shadows as if he was hiding. Something felt off, and that feeling prompted me to hit the floodlights on the ambulance, illuminating most of the yard. The moment the lights came on, we saw 5 to 7 men with tire irons and baseball bats standing in what used to be pitch blackness. My driver hit it in reverse and we got the hell out of there. I got on the radio and called for immediate assistance. Turns out, those guys were planning on jumping us, stealing the drugs from the ambulance and taking the rig for a joyride. It was poor planning, really, because we don't carry narcotics on a basic life support ambulance. To this day, I fear what would have happened if we had just walked up to the patient. This is not paranormal, but when I was about 7 years old, I went on a walk with my babysitter. We were walking back a mile or so to my house when about halfway there she said, "We should play Simon Says." At first, we walked faster, then skipped, and then jogged lightly. Then she says in a serious tone, "Simon Says run as fast as you can." I was slightly confused, but played along. As we turned down the driveway, I looked back and saw 2 guys chasing after us, one with a bat and the other with a knife. We ran up to a house and thankfully, some old people living there let us in. At the time, I didn't grasp how scary the situation was or why they were chasing us. I used to do regular volunteer work at a religious shrine, and since I had to travel halfway across the country to get there, I was provided with accommodation. The place I stayed in dated back centuries, and every time I stayed there, something would happen that couldn't be explained logically. But this story is my favorite. I had traveled all day, arriving at the shrine just as they were about to stop serving the evening meal. I grabbed some food, took a shower, and collapsed into bed, completely exhausted. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a woman's voice right next to my ear, speaking in a broad Yorkshire accent. "Are you all right, love?" Still half asleep, I automatically replied that I was fine, not really focusing. A moment later, I was sitting up in bed with all the lights on, asking myself what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to get back to sleep. The next morning, I ran into a staff member who had known me for many years. He asked how my journey had been, and I told him it was fine, but that something really weird had happened during the night. He asked what room I'd been put in, and when I told him, he simply said, "Oh, what did she say to you?" Come to find that this was always the last room they would put anyone in because so many people had complained of hearing things in there. When that wing of the building was being renovated, the builders used the room to store their equipment and frequently found things moved around. I have to say that, after the initial shock, I wasn't scared. My dad, who had a great interest in the paranormal, had always told me that what most people think of as ghosts aren't malicious, but simply people who have lost their way and can't move on. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories. See you in the next video!